I have submitted 3 formal requests for reclassification of this incident. All 3 were returned without action. My supervisor at the Veloreth Xenobiological Survey Institute has declined to forward the documentation to the Compact's Threat Assessment Division on the grounds that the Velkareth debris tract is classified non-operational, a notation that has not been reviewed in 411 years. He told me, with a patience I found insulting, that a non-operational designation by definition precludes the events I have described, and that I should consider whether prolonged solo field deployment might have affected my readings. I have therefore decided to file this account outside the Institute's formal record system. My name is Veltharan Orvan. I hold the rank of Senior Field Voice, 3rd designation, Xenobiological Survey Branch of the Veloreth Compact. I have been conducting debris field surveys for 19 years. In that time, I have cataloged 11 major drift zones, logged 42 confirmed first contact artifacts of pre-compact civilizations, and submitted reports that have twice been cited in the Compact Encyclopedia of Lost Civilizations. I am not a person given to misreading instruments or inventing significance. I want that established before I describe what happened in the Velkareth tract on the 41st day of the survey. The Compact's Xenobiological Survey Branch dispatched me to the Velkareth debris tract 14 months ago as part of a systematic effort to catalog the remnants of pre-collapse technological civilizations in the outer margin. The tract is large, roughly 1.4 billion kilometers across, a loose sphere of derelict hulls, drifting plating, frozen debris, and scattered engine core fragments occupying what was once, according to the oldest navigational charts, a busy transit corridor. The estimates varied, but consensus among the 3 prior partial surveys placed the number of distinct hull profiles somewhere between 2,800 and 3,400. No single survey had ever completed a full inventory. That was my assignment: complete the first full inventory. 3,000 dead ships or thereabouts. Document their class, estimated age, material composition, technological signature, and any surviving markings. The Compact wanted a comprehensive record. There was talk of eventually opening the region to salvage expeditions, and the Institute wanted a proper catalog before the recovery crews turned the whole thing into raw material. I was given a survey vessel, the Particulate Inquiry, a 40-meter compact standard long-range field platform, and a single survey drone unit, designation Su-11, which the Crew Assignment Office had paired with me 7 years earlier on the Kelvareth Bone Field Survey, and which I had requested specifically for this deployment. Su-11 was not technically a companion. It was a mechanical survey assistant, a 2-meter-tall mobile drone chassis equipped with scan arrays, sample collection arms, a high-resolution optical suite, and a data processing core that could cross-reference field readings against the Compact's full xenobiological archive in approximately 0.3 seconds. It did not speak in the conventional sense. It communicated through a series of brief status tones and indicator lights, and it had a habit, which I had never managed to explain to my colleagues' satisfaction, of positioning itself slightly between me and any source of uncertain data, as though it were placing itself as a physical buffer between me and whatever I was trying to understand. I had found this habit reassuring over the years. There is something clarifying about a machine that identifies uncertainty and moves toward it rather than away. We entered the Velkareth tract on the 7th day of transit from Compact Outer Station Velmorn, and the scale of it hit me the way scale in these places always does, not as a number, but as a visual comprehension that arrived several seconds after I first saw the data. The Particulate Inquiry's sensors had already begun cataloging, and the preliminary sweep showed 2,847 significant mass returns within the first 200 million kilometers. Every one of them was cold. Every one of them was dead. The survey instruments gave them all the same signature, residual mass, no thermal gradient, no electromagnetic emission, no power trace. They read the way abandoned things read, like furniture in a house after everyone has left. I set the particulate inquiry to a systematic grid pattern and began from the outermost edge. In the first 3 weeks, we catalogued 1,412 hulls. The work had a rhythm to it that I found almost meditative. The inquiry would approach a hull, SU-11 would extend its scan arrays. We would measure, photograph, sample where access permitted, log the findings, and move on. The hulls were of various origins, different construction philosophies, different material choices, different architectural sensibilities. Some were very old, their plating corroded to almost nothing. Their internal structures collapsed under centuries of micro-impact accumulation and thermal cycling. Some were less old, better preserved by the cold of the tract, their shapes still recognizable. Some bore the markings of civilizations I recognized from prior survey work. Others were entirely unknown, their design vocabulary belonging to peoples the archive had no record of. Some were large. A few were extremely large, their silhouettes taking up an unusual portion of the viewport when I drifted alongside them in the survey skiff. These were the ones that gave me the most to think about during the long transit hours between sites, not because they were threatening, which they were not, being comprehensively dead, but because of what their size implied about the civilization that had built them. You build something 900 meters long and arm it and send it somewhere, and that act of building and arming and sending means something about who you were. It is a commitment. It is a statement. The statement does not become less true, because the civilization that made it is no longer here to stand behind it. None of them were alive. I want to be precise about this, because my supervisor's question about instrument readings has been repeated so often that I anticipate it. The survey instruments were calibrated at Velmorn before departure and recalibrated at the midpoint of the survey by the inquiry's own internal systems. SU-11 scan arrays were independently certified by the Institute before my deployment. The readings I obtained were not instrument error. I have the logs. The logs show what they show. I developed a detailed notation system over the first 2 weeks. Each hull received a primary classification: origin type, estimated era, construction pattern, damage type, structural integrity index. Each hull received a secondary notation of any markings present. Each hull received a brief descriptive paragraph, because I have always believed that good survey work is the kind someone could read in a century and still understand without needing the data tables. The dead ships of the Vel-Kareth tract deserved at minimum the courtesy of being described accurately while someone was still there to describe them. Some of the oldest hulls were beautiful, in the way that very old things sometimes are beautiful not despite their damage but through it, their form simplified by centuries of attrition into something essential. A trading vessel from a civilization I could not name, its hull abraded smooth on the leading edges by millennia of microparticle impacts, looking more like a river stone than a ship. A warship from a slightly less distant era, its weapons housings long since corroded shut, its prow still aimed at something no longer there to threaten. A passenger carrier of some kind, the internal geometry suggested it had carried large numbers of people in relative comfort, still intact enough that I could see the viewport arrangements along its habitation decks, the glass long gone but the framing still in place, row after row of empty windows looking out at a corridor. No one was traveling anymore. I noted all of this. I did my job. There were also, among the 3,000 dead ships, a number that bore the Iron Covenant construction signature, the same geometric discipline I would eventually see in its fullest expression on hull 1550. These were ships that had shared the corridor with whatever Iron Covenant installation had been placed here, at some point before the catastrophe that had closed it. They had not survived the catastrophe either. I catalogued each one carefully, noting the specific pattern of damage, which in several cases was consistent with the same impact events that had damaged their neighbors. They had died here with everyone else. I found this detail strange later, in a way I hadn't found it strange at the time. If a garrison ship had been stationed here to protect the corridor, and those ships had died in the corridor, alongside the traffic they might have been protecting, what did that imply about the nature of the event that had killed them? What had been large enough or fast enough that not even the garrison's own Iron Covenant hulls had survived it? I did not have an answer. I still do not. I have noted the question in the supplemental appendix. Su-11 was a reliable presence through all of this. It worked with a consistency that I had come to rely on over 7 years. Its scan cycles regular, its sampling methodical, its classification outputs flagged precisely where its confidence was limited. On several occasions during the first 2 weeks, it positioned itself between me and a hull that had given unusual initial readings, holding its physical buffer stance until the readings resolved into something explicable. Each time, the hull turned out to be inert. Each time, I appreciated the gesture for what it was, not a reliable threat detection system, but an honest acknowledgement that something had exceeded its parameters, and that it was, in its mechanical way, taking the situation seriously. On the 40th day, in Grid Sector 17, I logged hull number 1546, a mid-sized craft of unknown origin, badly damaged, structurally compromised, and moved on to the next flagged contact on the day's priority list. Hull 1547, Hull 1548, Hull 1549. The fourth flagged hull was different. The 41st day began unremarkably. We were in Grid Sector 17 of 22, working through a denser concentration of hulls near the geometric center of the tract where, the preliminary sweep suggested, several catastrophic collision events had compressed the debris into a closer arrangement. Some of the hulls here showed evidence of impacts, hull surfaces bearing the long, ragged scoring patterns that come from objects hitting them at high relative velocity. Whatever had happened in this corridor had been significant. There were no records in the compact archive of what had caused it. Su-11 had flagged 4 hulls in the sector for detailed analysis based on preliminary sweep readings, unusual mass distribution signatures that its cross-referencing logic had not been able to classify. This was not unusual. Perhaps a quarter of the hulls in the tract were of unknown construction origin, belonging to civilizations that predated compact archival records or whose technical characteristics lay outside the database parameters. I noted the flags and added them to the day's priority list. We approached the first 3 flagged hulls in sequence. All 3 turned out to be unusual only in material composition, an alloy combination the archive hadn't seen precisely before, which I noted carefully. Cold, dead, inert. Hull number 1547, hull number 1548, hull number 1549. The 4th flagged hull was different. It was large. I want to say that first, because I think the size of it was part of what happened, though I couldn't have articulated why at the time. The inquiry's initial approach readings gave me a length estimate of approximately 900 meters, which would have made it one of the larger intact hulls in the tract. Most of the very large hulls had broken apart or were badly damaged. This one appeared substantially intact, its silhouette clean and deliberate against the debris field. I noted unusual construction architecture. The hull had a quality to its lines that none of the other hulls in the tract shared, a kind of geometric precision that spoke of purpose rather than utility. The designers had not been interested in elegance. They had been interested in function, and they had pursued function with a thoroughness that, in retrospect, I should have read as significant long before I did. I brought the inquiry to a standard survey distance of 4,000 meters and deployed Su-11 in the survey skiff for the close approach. The drone unit moved toward the hull on its standard trajectory, scan arrays extended and active. I watched from the Inquiry's forward observation station as SU-11's transmissions came back in real time. The hull showed the same readings I had come to expect: cold, no thermal gradient, no electromagnetic emission, no power trace. There was light corrosion on the outermost layer of hull plating, and several of the structural members along the ventral face showed the effects of thermal cycling over a long period: expansion and contraction, microfracturing consistent, with roughly 200 to 300 years of exposure. I noted that the hull did not appear to have been involved in the collision events that had damaged its neighbors. It was positioned at a slight angle that suggested it had drifted in from a different trajectory, perhaps more recently than the surrounding debris. SU-11 completed its initial surface sweep and transmitted the results. Nothing anomalous. I approved its approach for close-range hull sampling and began composing my preliminary notation in the survey log. The sampling pass was standard. SU-11 moved along the hull's dorsal surface at a range of approximately 40 meters. Its collection arm extended to take material samples from the outermost plating at 6 designated points. I monitored the transmission feed without particular attention, still composing my notation. The first 3 samples returned without incident. The 4th sample point was approximately a third of the way along the hull's dorsal surface, near what I had initially read as a sensor array housing of some kind. SU-11's transmission cut for 0.7 seconds. This was not normal. SU-11 had never had a transmission dropout in 7 years of operation. I looked up from my notation. The transmission restored itself, and then immediately showed something I had never seen the drone's output display before. SU-11 had reversed its approach trajectory and was moving back toward the Inquiry at its maximum transit velocity. Simultaneously, its alert indicator had changed from the standard green survey active to a pattern I did not recognize, a rapid double-pulse amber sequence that was not in my operational manual. I had 3 seconds to wonder what that meant before the hull lit up. I use that phrase deliberately because there is no more accurate description. The hull went from cold and dark to illuminated in the span of less than 1 second. Not catastrophically, it did not detonate or emit any threatening burst. It simply became visible in a way it had not been before, its engine housings along the stern beginning to emit a dim glow that started at almost nothing and grew steadily over the course of perhaps 30 seconds into something that I can only describe as purposeful. Not angry, not hostile, simply awake. SU-11 reached the Inquiry's docking bay and secured itself while I was still processing what I was looking at. The hull, the ship, I should say, because calling it a hull no longer felt accurate, was turning. Slowly and with absolute precision, its bow section rotating on an axis that spoke of intact attitude control systems operating well within their tolerances, until it was facing me directly. I should document my internal state at this point. I was not panicking. I am not, by disposition, a person who panics, and 19 years of field survey work in isolated and occasionally difficult environments had left me with a reasonably steady response to unexpected readings. What I felt was something closer to the intellectual recognition of a very large number, the kind of moment when a quantity that has been abstract becomes concrete, and you realize the abstraction had been protecting you from understanding what the number actually meant. The ship was not dead. It had never been dead, and it was looking at me. I did not reach for the Inquiry's drive controls. I want to be clear about this, because several colleagues who reviewed my account have suggested I should have. What I reached for instead was SU-11's data output, which was streaming in continuous transmission now that the drone was aboard. The alert pattern it had displayed, the rapid double-pulse amber I didn't recognize, turned out to be in SU-11's operating manual after all. I had simply never encountered it in 19 years. It was the designation code for the following condition: Survey target identified as active and occupied military installation. Approach discontinued per protocol, awaiting further instruction from field voice. I read that 3 times. Active occupied military installation. The hull I had catalogued as number 1550 in a dead ship graveyard. The ship that had been cold and dark and inert when SU-11 had begun its approach sweep was not a relic. It was not derelict. It had no damage consistent with abandonment because it had not been abandoned. I sat in the inquiry's observation station and watched the ship's engine glow continue to build, and I tried to understand what I was looking at. The compact archive had given me an incomplete picture of who had operated in this region of the margin before the collapse. There were fragments, navigational charts, trade records, a few recovered signal logs from other derelict hulls in the tract that suggested the corridor had once been heavily trafficked by a civilization whose construction philosophy was different from anything currently operating in compact space. They had built large. They had built with a certain functional severity that my own species' architecture did not share. Several of the hulls we had catalogued bore their markings, a geometric symbol that the archive classified as Iron Covenant, origin civilization, pre-collapse, technological status unknown, threat classification not assessed. Not assessed meant the archive had no data to make a determination. Not assessed was the classification you gave something when you didn't know enough to categorize it. It was, in my field, the most honest notation you could make. It was also, I had always thought, the most uncomfortable one, because it acknowledged that you had reached the limit of what your knowledge could tell you without pretending that the limit was the same as an answer. I began running the inquiry's passive sensors at maximum sensitivity against the ship. Not an active scan. I did not want to do anything that could be interpreted as a threatening action, just passive monitoring, collecting whatever emissions the ship was generating on its own and feeding them to the data systems for analysis. The results came back over the following 12 minutes, and I logged them carefully because I knew that whoever reviewed this account would want the data rather than my impression of it. The reactor signature was consistent with a long-cycle sustained operation power plan of a type SU-11's archive cross-reference, identified as Iron Covenant Garrison Dreadnought, operational class designation unavailable, power output range 4.8 to 5.4 terawatts at survey-consistent readings, estimated operational status, active maintenance cycle within normal parameters. The structural integrity readings showed no critical damage. The apparent surface weathering I had noted earlier was cosmetic rather than structural, consistent with long-duration cold-soak operational profile rather than with neglect or damage. The attitude control systems, as I had observed, were functioning. The sensor array housings I had noted on the hull's dorsal surface, the ones near where SU-11 had encountered whatever it had encountered on its 4th sampling pass, were not sensor array housings. They were targeting array housings. The ship had 9 of them. I want to dwell on this for a moment, because the number 9 sounds small until you understand what a targeting array is and what it implies about the weapon systems it serves. Each of the 9 housings was, according to SU-11's archive cross-reference, consistent with a primary weapons control node of the Iron Covenant garrison pattern, the kind used to coordinate large-scale kinetic delivery systems. The archive's technical data on what large-scale kinetic delivery systems meant in Iron Covenant terms was fragmentary, but the fragments suggested the phrase was doing a great deal of work. They had built their weapons the way they had built everything else, with a functional severity that my species' engineers, who had never needed to think in those terms, would find difficult to conceptualize. The ship had not armed those systems. Every reading I was getting suggested the weapons arrays were in standby, present, functional, catalogued by the ship's own operational systems in the same way that a person walking through a door catalogues the width of the opening without doing anything about it. The guns were simply there. The ship knew I was there. The two facts existed in proximity without any action being taken, and I found myself operating under the assumption that this situation would persist only for as long as I did not give the ship a reason to change it. I logged everything. I continued to log. On the 43rd minute after the ship had powered up, I received a transmission. The inquiry's communication system flagged it as incoming, and I accepted it with approximately the same internal state a person might have when accepting a communication from a government official they have not summoned and had not expected. The transmission was a continuous loop broadcast on a frequency I had not been monitoring. The frequency, my communication system told me, was associated with Iron Covenant garrison installations, Treaty Notification Protocol, and had been broadcasting at low power, apparently continuously, for an estimated period consistent with the ship's time in the tract. I want to note that number. The ship had been broadcasting a low-power treaty notification on a specific frequency, continuously, for approximately 280 years. The broadcast was not in any language in the compact archive. SU-11 spent 4 minutes attempting to cross-reference its linguistic database, and returned a negative result with a notation I had never seen it generate before. Language family not represented in archive. Architectural linguistic analysis suggests derivation from Iron Covenant root forms. Machine translation confidence below reliable threshold. Recommend expert consultation. SU-11 had never told me it couldn't do something. In 7 years of operation, it had simply done things, or it had told me what level of confidence to assign to its output. Recommending expert consultation was a new category of response entirely, and I noted it in the log with an attention that went beyond professional diligence. The drone had reached the edge of what it could do, and it was telling me honestly. What I could determine from the transmission structural analysis, without being able to translate the content, was its pattern. It was not an aggressive hail. It was not a threat. The transmission had a repetitive cyclical structure with clearly delineated sections, 2 of which repeated on a shorter cycle than the rest. SU-11 classified this pattern as consistent with administrative broadcast, informational content, repeated identification, and jurisdictional notation. In plain terms, the ship was not threatening me. It was telling me what it was and presumably why it was here. I thought about that for a long time. The ship had been in this debris field for 280 years. For 280 years it had broadcast, at low power, on a garrison protocol frequency, a message that no one in the compact had been equipped to receive or translate. For 280 years, survey missions that had approached the tract had not come close enough to trigger whatever identification threshold my survey drone had reached on its 4th sampling pass. The 3 prior surveys had catalogued parts of the outer field and departed. None of them had entered the grid sector, where this ship had been waiting. I had come to map a graveyard. I had mapped 3,000 dead ships, more or less, pending my completion of sectors 18 through 22, and the 3,001st had been watching all of them. I thought about the scope of that. Not the threat of it. I was not, at that point, experiencing what I would characterize as fear, though I acknowledge the distinction between fear and its absence is sometimes a matter of how long you have had to think about something. I thought about what it meant that a ship had been here for 280 years, broadcasting on a frequency no one was listening to, waiting with what appeared to be complete indifference to the duration of the wait, while the rest of the corridor it occupied had died around it and filled up with 3,000 other ships that could not make the same claim. Whatever had caused the catastrophe in the Velkarith tract, whatever had sent 3,000 hulls cold and dark and drifting in this corridor, had not caused this ship to stop. I will admit to something here that I have not included in my formal submissions, because my formal submissions were professional documents, and this account is not. I stayed in the observation station for 4 hours without moving, watching the ship and monitoring the passive sensor feed. And during those 4 hours, I experienced a quality of attention that I had not felt since the 7th year of my career, when I had first encountered a ruin complex on the moon of Velthar that had turned out to be 3,000 years older than any civilization in the archive had any business having built. That feeling of looking at something and understanding, without being able to articulate the mechanism, that the frame you have been using to interpret the world is too small, is one I can still recall with precision. It does not happen often. I would not call it comfortable. I have come to think of it as the most honest experience available to someone in my field. On the 4th hour, I composed a transmission. I had no way to translate the ship's broadcast or to send anything the ship systems could parse. What I sent was a standard compact xenobiological survey identification signal, the kind I send to any archaeological or artifact site at the beginning of a cataloging operation, informing the record that I am present and that my activities are archival in nature. I sent it because it was the professional thing to do when conducting survey work in proximity to a site that turned out to be more significant than initially classified. I sent it also, I will admit, because doing so felt more honest than pretending the ship was not there. The ship received the transmission. I know this because 2 minutes after I sent it, the broadcast pattern changed. The main body of the transmission remained the same content, same cycle, but one of the 2 shorter cycle sections, which SU-11 had been tracking, shifted to a new pattern. The drone cross-referenced it against the Garrison Protocol classification it had already established and returned a notation. Acknowledgement format, administrative receipt confirmation, passive observation status logged. The ship had noted my presence in its record. I logged this and I sat with what it implied. The ship was keeping records. It had received my identification, confirmed receipt, and logged that I was there, and it had done so using what appeared to be a formal administrative procedure. It was not hostile. It was not alarmed. It was simply conducting its operations, whatever those operations were. With the same methodical precision it had apparently applied to the preceding 280 years, and it had added a notation to its own records that a compact survey voice had identified itself in proximity to the installation. I stayed for 6 more days. I know this requires explanation. My original survey schedule had 7 days of operational time remaining in Grid Sector 17, before I needed to move to Sector 18 to maintain the completion timeline I had committed to in my survey plan. The 6 additional days represented a meaningful delay. I have been asked whether the delay was professionally appropriate, and I have answered that question the same way each time. Yes, because the site turned out to be significantly different from its preliminary classification, and the responsible course of action when a site turns out to be significantly different from its preliminary classification is to spend more time on it, not less. The second day, the ship's engine glow stabilized at a level that SU-11 classified as sustained low-power operational output, consistent with station keeping rather than transit. It was not powering up further. It was not powering down. It held exactly the configuration it had reached in the first 30 seconds after it had detected the drone, and it held it with a steadiness that suggested the power management was not idle fluctuation but deliberate maintenance. Whatever state it had chosen to be in relative to my presence, it had chosen it, and it was keeping it. I noticed, over those 6 days, that the ship's attitude did not remain fixed. Once an hour, with a regularity that I eventually began to anticipate, the hull would make a very small adjustment, a change of perhaps 1 or 2 degrees in its orientation, a shift in its bow heading that was subtle enough that I would not have caught it if I had not been watching continuously. SU-11 logged each adjustment automatically, and on the second day, offered me an analysis. The adjustments were not random. They described a systematic pattern the hull was, over the course of each 24-hour period, completing a slow sweep of the surrounding sector. Not just watching me, watching everything. The rotation would bring the ship's bow through a full review of the debris field in a cycle that, extrapolated, had probably been ongoing for most of its 280 years. I was simply one object in a comprehensive inventory that never stopped. On the third day, I attempted to calculate how many objects the ship had observed during that period. The debris field was not static. Hulls drifted, minor collisions redistributed material. The slow mechanics of a dead corridor shifted its contents over decades and centuries. The ship had been watching all of it. Every drift, every new position, every collision. I stopped the calculation when the scope of it began to feel less like data and more like something else. The accumulation of a kind of attention so patient and so comprehensive that calling it observation seemed insufficient. Vigil was the word I eventually settled on, though I am aware that is not a technical term. I did not approach closer than the 4,000-meter observation distance. I did not attempt another survey drone pass. I conducted all subsequent observation from passive sensors and monitored the ship's transmissions continuously, logging every change in the broadcast pattern and submitting SU-11's running linguistic analysis to the inquiry's data system for later processing. I photographed the ship from every angle available to me at 4,000 meters. I made detailed structural notes. I attempted, using the architectural analysis tools in the inquiry's survey suite, to construct an estimate of the ship's weapons systems based on what was visible externally, and I stopped when the output became detailed enough that I felt uncomfortable having it on a survey vessel with no military clearance and nowhere to store it securely. What I can say about the hull from the photographic record is this: it had been built to be seen from a distance and to register correctly from that distance as exactly what it was. There was no ambiguity in its lines. The construction philosophy of the Iron Covenant, from what I had seen across 3,000 dead hulls and one living one, was not interested in disguise or ambiguity. They built things that announced themselves. The dead ships in the debris field bore the same quality even in their ruined state. You could tell, from their shapes, that they had been designed by people who considered a thing's function to be its clearest statement of itself. This ship, undamaged and operational, was the clearest statement possible. 900 meters of it, sitting in a dead corridor, broadcasting its administrative status on the correct frequency, waiting. What I can say, without the weapons detail that I have kept separately, is this: the ship was large enough and armed sufficiently that the question of whether it could defend the corridor it was occupying was not a useful question. That framing assumed some external force might threaten the occupation. The more accurate way to think about it was the other way around. The corridor was occupied. The occupation was not temporary, and had not become temporary by virtue of the civilization that had established it having been absent from this part of space for several centuries. The occupation was exactly as it had been the day the ship had been placed here, which was to say, total, unambiguous, and patient in a way that made the word patient feel inadequate. On the fifth day, I sent a second transmission. This one was not a standard survey identification signal. I had spent 4 days composing it, using every linguistic construction tool available to SU-11 and the inquiry's survey suite, attempting to build something that crossed the archive gap in both directions. What I arrived at was a brief mathematical notation, a simple sequence that indicated my awareness of the administrative nature of the broadcast I was receiving, my understanding that the installation was claiming jurisdictional authority over the corridor, and my intention to include this understanding in my survey report, and to file the survey report with the appropriate compact authorities. It was, I thought, the correct professional response. I was a survey voice. I had encountered a site. The site had claims that my agency needed to know about. I was informing the site that I was going to tell the agency. The ship received the transmission. The broadcast pattern changed again. SU-11's running analysis returned a notation after 11 minutes. Acknowledgement format, administrative receipt confirmation, report filed. And then, after a brief pause that I have replayed many times in the months since, survey voice identification logged, corridor access advisory issued, advisory type consistent with navigation caution notation. The ship had issued me a navigation caution. It had filed my identification in its own record, confirmed it would note the forthcoming report, and cautioned me to navigate carefully in the corridor. I spent a very long time sitting with that. On the 6th day, I completed my observation notes and prepared to move on to Grid Sector 18. Before I did, I made one final passive sweep of the area around the ship, not a targeted scan, simply the survey grid standard completion pass. And the results showed me something I have included in my formal submissions, but which my supervisor has not found significant. The ship was not alone. The passive sweep, at the sensitivity I had been running for the previous 6 days, returned 12 additional mass signatures in the surrounding debris field that had not appeared in any of my earlier survey readings. They were small, much smaller than the main hull, ranging from 30 to 60 meters in profile, consistent with small craft or drone units. They were cold in the way the main hull was cold. Not cold because they had lost power, but cold in the specific way of systems running at very low operational output, conserving energy rather than generating it. SU-11 cross-referenced the signatures and returned a classification of Iron Covenant Garrison Deployment Pattern, Autonomous Patrol Unit Configuration, Watch Silence Operational Mode. 12 watch units, in a 250-kilometer radius around the main hull, silent for, presumably, the same 280 years. They had been there the whole time. They had been there when the 3 prior surveys had skirted the outer edges of the tract and not come close enough to trigger the identification threshold. They had been there during every transit, every drift, every minor collision that had redistributed the debris around them. They had simply waited, at low power, watching. Every survey pass I had made through the region for 40 days had registered them as debris and logged them as such, because at the sensitivity I had been running they were indistinguishable from the material that surrounded them. They had been indistinguishable deliberately. I filed the coordinates of all 12 units in my survey log, alongside the coordinates of the main hull. I sent a final transmission to the main hull, a simple administrative notation of survey completion and departure, and received a final broadcast modification in return that SU-11 classified as Administrative Departure Acknowledgement, Corridor Navigation Advisory Updated, Identification Archived. Then I moved on to Grid Sector 18 and continued mapping the dead ships. I completed the survey 42 days later. The final inventory stands at 3,207 distinct hull profiles in the Velkareth tract, across all 22 sectors. The dead ships, the ones that had stopped, represented 3,206 of those profiles. Their data is in the formal survey report that I submitted to the Institute on my return to Velmorn, and which has been accepted and acknowledged and filed, and will presumably eventually be used by the salvage expedition that the Compact is planning. The 3,207th entry in the survey, hull designation Iron Covenant Garrison Installation, Velkareth, main hull plus 12 autonomous patrol units, operational status active, is in a supplemental appendix to the formal survey report that my supervisor has not forwarded to the Compact's treaty authority. He has told me it will be reviewed. He has been telling me this for 4 months. I am filing this account separately because I believe it matters that someone who has the authority to act on it understands what I found in that debris field. I am not a military officer. I do not have access to the compact's threat assessment or diplomatic infrastructure. What I have is the survey log, SU-11's full data output, the recordings of every transmission I received and every transmission I sent, and 19 years of professional experience that I am willing to stake on the accuracy of what I have written here. The Velkarith Tract is not a graveyard. It was a transit corridor, a busy one, according to what fragments of pre-collapse navigational data survive, and something happened to it, some event or series of events that ended 3,206 of the ships that used it. Whatever happened did not end all of them. One was placed there, not lost, not destroyed, not abandoned, and has been in that corridor for 280 years, broadcasting on the correct frequency for its administrative status, keeping records, acknowledging survey voices who identify themselves properly, issuing navigation cautions to civilian vessels that wander into its operational area. That ship is not waiting for something to happen. It is doing what it was placed there to do. The fact that the civilization that placed it there has been absent from this region of space for several centuries does not appear to have affected this calculus in any way that the ship has chosen to express in its transmissions. The survey report I submitted to the Institute describes the Velkarith Tract as a closed archaeological site recommended for heritage classification pending further review. That is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not say, what my supervisor's decision not to forward the supplemental appendix means the compact's relevant authorities do not yet know, is the other thing. The thing that I believe matters more than the heritage classification, and more than the salvage expedition that will have to be quietly canceled, when someone eventually reads the supplemental appendix and understands what it means. The 3,000 dead ships in that corridor are dead because something put them there. The one that was not dead was placed there at some point in the corridor's history to watch, not to threaten, not to engage, simply to watch. The watch is still ongoing. What I keep thinking about, what I find myself returning to in the months since the survey, in the evenings when the inquiry is in transit and SU-11 is in its docking bay, and I have nothing to occupy my attention except the data logs and my own thoughts, is not the ship itself. It is the 12 watch units, the small ones, 30 to 60 meters, dispersed in a 250-kilometer radius, cold and quiet in watch silence mode for 280 years. They were positioned facing outward, all 12 of them. I did not note this in the supplemental appendix because I was not certain of its significance and I did not want to overstate my conclusions. But I have looked at the data many times since, and I am certain of the reading. The 12 watch units were positioned facing outward, away from the main hull, looking at the debris field that surrounded them. Which means they were not watching the debris field to understand it. The main hull was already doing that. It had been doing it for 280 years, and its records were presumably comprehensive. 3,000 dead ships, catalogued in detail by a ship that had watched each one arrive, either in the original catastrophe that filled the corridor or in the slow drift of subsequent centuries. The 12 watch units were positioned facing outward because they were watching for whatever might eventually come from outside the debris field. They were watching the approaches. They were watching for traffic. I sent my administrative departure transmission and received my acknowledgement and navigation caution, and then I moved my survey vessel out of their operational area and continued mapping the dead ships. And I have been trying ever since to decide what the correct professional response is to the understanding that I was the first traffic in that corridor in, presumably, a very long time. And that every second of my 6-day observation was logged and archived by systems that have been logging and archiving whatever crosses that corridor for 280 years. And that somewhere in the operational records of a garrison installation that has not heard from its parent civilization in longer than any living member of the compact has been alive, there is now a notation that reads, Survey Voice, Veloreth Compact, Xenobiological Survey Branch, Senior Field Voice 3rd Designation, 1 vessel, 1 mobile survey unit, identified, acknowledged, caution issued, corridor access noted, identification archived. I asked SU-11, on the transit back to Velmorn, what it thought the ship's garrison continuance broadcast said. The drone has no capacity for speculation. It returned a notation of translation confidence below reliable threshold, and offered me the architectural linguistic analysis it had been running for 16 days, which was the most detailed analysis it could offer. I read the analysis. SU-11 had been right that translation confidence was below reliable threshold. But the analysis had identified several recurring structural elements that were consistent across the broadcast's main cycle, and it had flagged 2 of them as likely semantic anchors, the kinds of constructions that tend to carry the administrative load of a message, even when the surrounding content is unclear. The first semantic anchor appeared to be a location notation. Velkareth, the corridor, this is ours. The second semantic anchor was harder to parse. SU-11 gave it a confidence rating of 31%, which is low enough that I would normally discount it entirely. I have not discounted it. The notation read, construction consistent with administrative weighting notation. Possible meanings include holding, maintenance of status, record in progress, or a phrase not representable in archive terminology that the drone suggested might be most closely approximated as still here. Still here. For 280 years. In a dead corridor surrounded by the ships that did not make it, broadcasting to no one in particular on the correct frequency, keeping records, watching the approaches. The same transmission, the same frequency, the same methodical attitude sweep, once an hour, every hour for 280 years. I have done the arithmetic. That is roughly 2,450,000 attitude sweeps. 2,450,000 slow rotations through the debris field, logging whatever had moved, noting whatever had drifted, keeping the record current. Still here. I have filed 3 requests for reclassification. All 3 were returned without action, without explanation, and without any indication that the person reviewing them had read the supplemental appendix. I will file a 4th. If the 4th is returned, I will file a 5th. I am a survey voice. Filing records is what I do, and I intend to keep doing it until one of my records reaches someone who understands what it says. In the meantime, I want it on record that the Velkareth debris tract is not what the non-operational designation says it is. The designation has not been reviewed in 411 years. In that 411 years, one of the things it failed to review has been watching the corridor and keeping records and waiting for someone to come close enough to notice that the corridor was not empty. I came close enough, I noticed. The ship noted my identification in its records and issued me a navigation caution and watched me leave. I am not certain what it is waiting for. I am not certain who it is waiting for. I know what it is, and I know it is still there, and I believe that the compact's relevant authorities should know it too, before the salvage expedition reaches the tract with survey instruments and recovery equipment, and not a single person aboard who has been briefed on what a garrison continuance broadcast pattern sounds like, or what to do when a 900-meter Iron Covenant garrison dreadnought that has been cold-soaked in a debris field for 280 years finishes its cold start sequence and turns to face you. The salvage expedition my supervisor is planning consists of 14 vessels, recovery barges, material processing platforms, a small logistics tender, no military hulls, no communications officers trained on garrison protocol frequencies, no xenolinguists, no one who would know what a targeting array housing looks like or what it implies about the systems behind it. They would arrive with their cataloging equipment and their recovery tools and their schedule for converting 3,000 dead ships into usable raw material, and they would enter Grid Sector 17, and the 900-meter hull that has been watching that sector for 280 years would complete its next 1-degree attitude adjustment and add them to its records. I know what that looks like. I was there. Su-11 is still flagging the system as active and occupied military installation, awaiting further instruction from Field Voice. I am still deciding what instruction to give.